The moment the server went dark mid-demo and Brent spun around like someone unplugged his ego, I knew something was off. Not who spilled coffee on the mainframe off. I mean bone-deep, boardroom-shaking, lawsuit bait off. And yet, there I was, smiling politely, pretending the glitch didn't gut our entire projections dashboard. Brent barked some nonsense about unstable legacy architecture, but I recognized the silence in the room. That wasn't technical failure. That was Jacob Reed pulling a lever somewhere. Quiet, intentional, surgical. Most people at SableX called him that back-end guy, like he was a sentient filing cabinet with legs. But I'd seen him work, watched him de-escalate vendor collapses with a single midnight call. He never raised his voice, never sent more than a 5-word email, and somehow still made payroll run during the liquidity scare of 19 when even our bank pretended not to know us. No exec could explain how our vendor rates stayed below market or why we still had access to infrastructure that should have expired years ago. They just assumed Brent's growth strategy was working. But I knew. Jacob was the duct tape and the blueprint. Brent was the Sharpie drawing over it. And when the founder stepped down, old school, cautious, believed in handshakes and dotted lines, I remember seeing Jacob's posture shift. Not dramatically, just a little more still. A little too still, like a man watching the dam crack, calculating where the water would hit first. Brent walked in with his loud teeth and McKinsey PowerPoint swagger, firing up words like disruption and vertical acquisition synergy before he even learned where the break room was. He didn't ask Jacob anything. Not about vendor lineage, not about licensing pathways, not about the absurd patchwork of IP permissions that kept us legally operational in 3 countries. Instead, Brent made it his mission to be seen, and Jacob's absence made that easier. Listen, real quick, if you're into stories like this, where quiet people flip the script on corporate arrogance, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Seriously, it takes 2 seconds, but it helps our whole team keep bringing you more. Back to the story. I got promoted during that shuffle, director of ops, which meant I suddenly had a front row seat to the mess. Brent's team, mostly imports from his last startup that died mid-Series B, started rewriting compliance checklists without checking compliance. Jacob? They reassigned him to internal continuity. That's exec speak for shut up and keep the lights on while we sell the building. He didn't fight it, just nodded like always, then went back to typing things that would probably keep us out of jail for another quarter. But I noticed things. Like how invoices started coming back flagged, how licensing keys expired in systems no one could access but Jacob. I brought it up once, carefully, and Brent brushed me off. We've got new systems coming anyway, out with the old. That's when I remembered something Jacob once said in a late-night Slack, back when we were pulling a 72-hour audit prep. Old systems don't die, they wait. I didn't know what he meant then, but I was about to. The announcement dropped during a catered town hall. Shrimp skewers, overpriced sliders, Brent's voice on a mic like he was hosting a TED Talk for narcissists. We're in talks with Vestra Group, he said, eyes glittering like he personally handcrafted the $85 million valuation. Half the room gasped. The other half Googled who Vestra was. I watched Jacob. He didn't even flinch, just sat near the back, sipping stale coffee like someone reading obituaries that hadn't been printed yet. The moment that number hit the screen, things shifted. Everyone got louder. The Slack channels exploded with champagne emojis and speculation. New titles were tossed around like candy. Director this, VP that, as if the ink was already dry. Brent's golden boys started walking like they'd already been acquired. But Jacob? He just kept working. Same desk, same terminal, same worn-out hoodie that probably knew more about our infrastructure than our entire IT department. I got pulled into the due diligence prep team, mostly because I was one of the few people who could string together 3 accurate sentences about our backend without sweating. The irony? Every system I described was one Jacob had either duct-taped, rebuilt, or entirely restructured. But his name? Nowhere. Brent's new assistant even said, "Let's not include legacy clutter unless they ask." Legacy clutter. This was a man who single-handedly kept our vendor contracts from imploding during the 2020 payment freeze, who rebuilt our IP licensing structure to survive a compliance audit that should have shuttered us. And Brent wanted to white out his entire existence like he was a broken printer cartridge. I told Jacob, gently, that his name wasn't being submitted. He just nodded, said, "I'm focusing on continuity." But his eyes? Different. Not sad, not angry, just measuring, like he was watching people rearrange deck chairs on a ship he already rewelded below the waterline. That night, I stayed late, had a few invoices to cross-check against vendor codes that hadn't been touched in years. Around 9:40 p.m., I passed Jacob's desk, still lit. He didn't notice me. His screen showed a familiar interface, one of the old encrypted shell drives from our crisis days. I hadn't seen that portal open in over 5 years. He navigated without hesitation. No notes, no reminders, just muscle memory. Then I saw the file name. Stonewell Holdings, Contract Index, Rev 2. I froze. I remembered that name. Barely. It was whispered during the tail end of our last funding crunch when Jacob had restructured some operational assets to preserve vendor flow. We all thought it was just paperwork gymnastics to buy us time. Some holding shell to keep things running while we got our heads above water. The founder signed off on it, said, "If Jacob's writing it, I trust it." I never saw the full version. No one did. Until now. He closed the window as I approached. No tension, just a raised eyebrow like, "Still working?" I asked him what Stonewell was still doing in our system. He just replied, "Redundancy, in case the wrong people start thinking they're the right ones." And then he went back to typing. Like that sentence meant nothing. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something was off, not just in the system, in Jacob, in the way he was moving, not out of place, just no longer part of the room. Like he was watching from the outside, waiting for the temperature to change, or the roof to cave in. It started with a voicemail from legal, not mine, Jacob's. I only heard about it because Tanya from compliance forwarded me a transcript with a subject line that read, "Can you make sense of this?" The message was short, terse. "Hi, Jacob. We're reviewing the vendor reassignment logs from Q3 2020, and we need clarification on infrastructure delegation, something about original pathways not matching current asset holders." I asked him about it in passing the next morning, and he didn't even pause his typing, just said, "They're looking at the wrong version of the contracts." That was it. No elaboration, no panic. Like someone telling you the stove's off when your house smells like smoke. Meanwhile, Brent was busy playing ringmaster for Vestra's legal circus, talking about operational transparency like he invented it. In every call, he assured the buyers that SableX owned everything outright. His words, outright. And yet, more flags kept popping up. Legal flagged inconsistencies between old vendor contracts and the names listed in our current asset ledger. When I tried to trace the IP license renewals, I hit encrypted shell records routed through something called SWH Trust Proxy. That's when I started connecting the dots. SWH Stonewell Holdings. I checked our internal permissions registry. Jacob's access hadn't been downgraded. Not once. He still held root credentials for over 80% of our back-end systems. The same credentials we told Vestra were centralized under corporate ownership. When I brought it up to Brent, he scoffed. "He's just the old guard. We'll migrate everything post-deal. Except you can't migrate what you don't legally own." 3 days later, Jacob filed a formal HR request to reduce his hours in preparation for phase transition. No fanfare, no goodbye lunch, no cupcakes in the break room. Brent approved it within 5 minutes, forwarded me the email with "finally" as the only body text. They thought he was phasing himself out, stepping aside. They had no idea he was drawing a line between himself and them, and that's when the real shift happened. One night, after most of the team had left, I came back to grab my charger and saw Jacob in the server control room. That door is usually locked. He was alone, sleeves rolled, surgical with every keystroke. He wasn't deleting anything. He was reconfiguring backups. All automated mirroring processes that tied our infrastructure to his personal admin shell, gone. And in their place, a new batch of encrypted versions. Each one rerouted through certificates that match the original Stonewell trust structure, time-stamped, signed, archived in cold storage drives I didn't even know we still had. He looked up once, noticed me watching, and gave me the calmest nod I've ever seen. Not smug, not secretive, just inevitable. I asked him, quietly, what he was doing. He said, finalizing what should have stayed finalized, then turned back to his screen. It took me 2 hours and a pot of bad breakroom coffee to dig through what little was still visible in our asset registry. What I found nearly made me fall out of my chair. 5 years ago, in the middle of our worst liquidity crunch, Jacob didn't just fix vendor relationships. He legally reassigned operational rights to a private trust. Stonewell Holdings. Core vendor contracts? Stonewell. Legacy IP licensing chains? Stonewell. Master system administrator keys? All legally transferred. Stonewell. I cross-checked the signatures. Board approved. Quietly. Legally. Documented. It was all valid, and it had all been buried. Until now. The pause came on a Thursday. Quiet, clean, brutal. Vestra's legal team sent a single-sentence update. We are temporarily suspending forward movement pending clarification of ownership discrepancies. Brent read it aloud in the glass-walled conference room like it was a joke. Except no one laughed. In 1 hour, the building's entire energy shifted. Suddenly, the air wasn't filled with celebration talk or IPO daydreams. It was all muffled panic and tight jaws. Phones stopped ringing. Slack went dead silent. People started printing things again. That's when you know it's bad. Brent stormed into legal like a coked-up peacock, blaming everyone but himself. How the hell did this happen? Why is there a third-party name on the infrastructure certs? I was in the room. I watched our legal director, normally unflappable, flip through the asset index binder with trembling fingers, then glance at me and mutter, "Wasn't this consolidated?" Brent spun around. "Get Jacob, now." But Jacob didn't come. He didn't need to. He had already replied. 2 lines. 2 perfect surgical lines. Refer to the original vendor reassignment plan. Clause 7D, Stonewell Holdings has operational rights. No attachments, no extra fluff. Just a digital reminder that 5 years ago, when everyone was panicking about insolvency, Jacob had built a life raft. And now they were just realizing they'd never asked who owned the paddles. Brent lost it. Screamed something about insubordination and intellectual hostage-taking, then ordered IT to cut Jacob's access. I watched the head of IT blink like he'd just been asked to shut off gravity. "Sir," he said cautiously, "we can't." Brent's nostrils flared. "Why not?" "Because Jacob's credentials aren't corporate. He's listed as master custodian through the infrastructure trust. We don't control those keys, legally or technically." It was like watching someone get slapped across the soul. The silence in that room was a new kind of loud. Brent turned red, then pale, then tried to pretend he had a plan. He didn't. Legal scrambled, again, firing off a volley of emails to Jacob asking for cooperative clarification and urgent assistance with documentation reconciliation. Jacob sent nothing, at least not to them. But I got a copy of something, an invite, from Vestra's legal coordinator, subject line, infrastructure licensing clarification. Call body. Please confirm Jacob Reed's availability for 11 a.m. PST. The buyer requests his presence directly. Not Brent, not legal, not the founder. Jacob, the man they pushed out of the deal room, the man whose name was suddenly more important than the company's. I forwarded it to Brent without comment. He replied, "Decline it." But it was too late. Vestra didn't ask. They scheduled. They called it a clarification session, but the tone in the virtual room said otherwise. Vestra's background was all white walls and cold lighting, sterile, deliberate, surgical. Brent's camera was on too, though he looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. Legal flanked him with forced smiles, the kind you wear to a funeral you helped plan. I was there, mic muted, just a silent tile on the Zoom grid, watching the air get thinner by the second. Then Jacob joined. No fanfare, no corporate headshot. Just a quiet man in a faded crew-neck sweater, sitting in front of an unbranded wall. No credentials listed, just his name, Jacob Reed. The invite labeled him Legacy Consultant. The Vestra Council wasted no time. We need to verify current ownership of operational infrastructure, licensing continuity, and access authority. Brent leaned forward, slick as ever. Of course. All systems are registered to SableX. We have continuity documents prepared. We'd like to hear from Mr. Reed directly. Vestra cut in. Jacob didn't even blink. He reached beside him, not to a binder, not to a file cabinet, but to a single sheet of paper. He held it up to the camera like it was a mirror. One line, no fluff. All rights reserved by Stonewell Holdings. Primary signatory, Jacob Reed. Silence. You could hear someone on Vestra's end shift in their seat. Brent cleared his throat. That's an old structure. For temporary holding, we've since... Vestra's counsel interrupted. Is this agreement still active? Jacob nodded once. Legally binding, yes. Indefinite term. Last reviewed and re-signed 14 months ago. By whom? Me, as managing custodian of Stonewell Holdings. Brent went visibly pale. Legal beside him shuffled frantically through papers they didn't understand. Vestra's camera shifted slightly, enough for us to glimpse their head of finance whispering something off-screen. Their lead counsel straightened and spoke clearly. We will not be proceeding until the current operational owner signs off on infrastructure rights and system access continuity. There it was. The shift. They didn't say CEO, they didn't say SableX, they said owner. And that wasn't Brent. Jacob didn't smirk, didn't boast. He simply set the page back down and muted himself. Nothing else was needed. The call ended 15 minutes later, prematurely. Brent tried to regain footing, spinning some nonsense about transitional flexibility. Vestra didn't buy it. They were done talking to actors. They wanted the man holding the script. After the call, Brent paced the hall like a trapped animal. I heard him bark into the phone. How the hell did this happen? He still didn't get it. Jacob didn't hijack the company. They just forgot who built it. The confrontation came the morning after the call, behind closed doors, but loud enough for half the executive wing to hear. Brent had Jacob cornered in the small HR conference room, blinds half closed, voice sharp with the kind of bravado that only shows up when someone's desperate and knows they've already lost. You're an employee, Jacob, Brent snapped, tossing a folder onto the table like it meant something. This entire stunt, the trust, the shell company, all of it, is grounds for termination. Jacob didn't even look at the folder. He just folded his hands calmly, like he was waiting for a child to finish a tantrum. Not when it comes to Stonewell, he said evenly. I haven't been your employee since last Tuesday. That shut Brent up. I was just outside listening. You could hear the weight of those words hit the floor like a dropped safe. Brent recovered fast, or tried to. That's not processed. HR hasn't finalized it. Jacob nodded. It will be. I gave them notice, in writing, effective end of day Friday. Brent stammered something about breach of contract, about fiduciary duties, about employee loyalty, flailing legal threats he barely understood. But it didn't matter, because here's what the board finally realized. Jacob wasn't under them anymore. He didn't owe them compliance. He didn't owe them silence. And most critically, he didn't owe them access. Because without Stonewell, and by extension, Jacob, Vestra wouldn't sign. Infrastructure, systems continuity, vendor locks, IP chains, all the guts of the company were tied to Stonewell. And Stonewell was tied to Jacob. Full stop. The board called an emergency meeting. No slides, no advisors, just the raw facts. Brent tried to salvage his image with more puffed-up phrases about negotiation leverage. But this time, no one bit. Jacob was invited to the next session, not as staff, as a third-party principal. He walked in carrying a thin folder, one copy of a revised agreement. He didn't ask for a payout. He didn't throw demands. He just laid it on the table and said, if you want to close the deal, Stonewell will license the infrastructure to Vestra directly. Renewable lease, annual audit rights. Terms are non-negotiable. Brent nearly flipped the table. The board, however, didn't blink. They read the offer, slowly, carefully, and one by one nodded. Because it wasn't about ego anymore. It was about survival. Jacob wasn't gloating. He didn't smirk. He didn't monologue. He just sat there, perfectly still, while an empire realigned around him. He didn't seize power. He was the power. They just finally noticed. The number hit the boardroom like a gunshot. $59 million, down from 85. Vestra's revised offer was cold, clinical, and brutally clear. No Stonewell signature, no full valuation. The gap wasn't negotiable. It was surgical. They weren't buying chaos, and right now, that's all SableX looked like. Brent didn't even show up to that meeting. Word was, he'd been asked to step back from negotiations, which was the board's polite way of saying, get the hell out before you sink us further. Instead, they pulled in someone no one expected, the founder. Retired, long gone from the day-to-day, living somewhere in Maine with a dog named after an SEC clause. He joined by phone, not video, but the second his voice came through the speaker, the room straightened like kids caught cheating. I've reviewed the filings, he said, calm as ever. The Stonewell structure was documented, approved, necessary. Jacob's name is on it because I put it there. Brent's old allies squirmed in their seats. The GC tried to protest, something about lack of full disclosure. You trusted Jacob with the skeleton keys. The founder cut in, sharp enough to silence the room. He didn't betray you. You just never asked what room they opened. No one argued after that. They couldn't. Because there was no scandal, no breach, no trick, just a quiet structure built in a moment of desperation, a lifeboat that now floated above the wreckage Brent's team created. The call ended with a final line. Give Jacob what he needs, or take the 60 million hit. Your choice. From that moment on, Jacob wasn't a legacy employee. He wasn't an outsider. He was the center. Legal addressed him first in every meeting. Ops rerouted everything through his specs. The contract team, who used to mock his documentation style, now pored over his clauses like scripture. Even the Vestra delegation stopped talking to the exec team. They called Jacob directly. He didn't act smug. He didn't change his tone. He didn't upgrade his clothes or swap out his old ThinkPad. He just moved through the halls like gravity had shifted. Not heavier, just different. Like the building bent slightly around him now. I walked past him after one of the restructuring sessions. Asked if he was overwhelmed. He just said, "No, I've been here before. The only difference now is they finally see it." And they did. Every license, every vendor pathway, every inherited dependency they used to ignore. It all led to him. He didn't fight for control. He just never gave it away. The papers arrived on a Monday, the final set, clean and dry, stripped of the bloated language Brent's team once inflated like parade balloons. Jacob read through each line like a man proofreading blueprints he'd drawn years ago. No legal tricks, no buried clauses, just precision. A renewable, time-bound infrastructure lease from Stonewell Holdings to Vestra Group. 1-year term. Auto-renewal pending performance review, full control retained by Stonewell. He signed with a fountain pen. Not out of flair. He just didn't like plastic. The board didn't celebrate. No champagne, no speeches, just a long, quiet exhale as they watched the numbers stabilize. $59 million secured. Not the $85 they once dreamed of. But without Jacob, they'd be walking away with nothing but lawsuits and locked servers. Brent's team didn't survive the week. Officially, it was called a post-acquisition strategic realignment. But everyone knew what it really meant. Brent's keycard deactivated before his final exit interview. His deputy's Slack account went dark before the ink dried. No one mentioned their names again. Vestra, impressed by the cleanup and the clarity of Stonewell's structure, offered Jacob a permanent executive role, strategic director of systems continuity. He would have had a team, a black card, a corner office, the whole redemption arc. He turned it down, politely. Instead, he sent over a short email. Appreciate the offer. Decline respectfully. See attached list of recommended placements for systems oversight. 6 names, all vetted. All people he trusted. Some were even former interns the company barely remembered. Then he signed off. Literally. Logged out of his company email, disconnected his VPN, packed up the 2 notebooks he kept under his monitor, and left the building without fanfare. No goodbye speech, no dramatic monologue, just the soft click of a door closing behind him. Later that week, the founder emailed him privately. Short message, impressive restraint. Jacob replied with 1 line, "Thanks for backing my structure." It held. No glory, no headlines, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing the thing you built, the thing they laughed at, ignored, rewrote, stood up when it mattered. and now it was theirs, on lease. Renewable, at his discretion. The room was too quiet for a moment that big. Vestra's lead buyer, a woman with glacier eyes and a voice like a closing door, slid the final version of the agreement across the long conference table. Not toward the CEO, not toward legal. Just dead center, neutral, deliberate. The exec team sat frozen, dressed like power, pretending they still held it. The air smelled like toner and nerves. Someone coughed. No one moved. Then she said it. Not loudly, but it hit like a loaded statement. Get the real owner on. Every head in the room pivoted, slowly, collectively, to Jacob. He didn't rush, didn't blink, just stood, walked the same distance he used to make to refill a coffee mug during late-night server patching. He picked up the pen. Not the corporate branded ones stacked in front of Brent's replacement, but his own. Same fountain pen, black ink, smooth glide. He signed, and all the other pens poised mid-air in trembling hands froze. No second signatures followed, no clatter of applause, just stillness. Like the building itself understood a shift had occurred, tectonic and irreversible. I watched the CEO. His face drained, his lips parted like he wanted to speak but couldn't find words that wouldn't collapse under the weight of what just happened. His signature line on the agreement remained empty, irrelevant now. He wasn't the one who mattered. Jacob set the pen down gently, nodded once at the Vestra team, then turned without a word. The door clicked behind him with the finality of a sealed vault. No press release, no internal memo, no LinkedIn post about exciting new chapters. Just one deal closed, on Jacob's terms. As the silence held, the Vestra buyer leaned back, folded her hands, and looked directly at what was left of the Cyberlex leadership. Then, flatly, like reading a fact from a ledger, you didn't lose the deal. You just didn't own it in the first place.